Hi, my name is Steve Copeland. In this video, I'd like to offer several basic arguments for the existence of God, taken from my small apologetics book, Time for Truth, The Story of Salvation. So, is it possible to prove the existence of God? From a purely scientific point of view, we may say no. However, we may also find ourselves trying to define what we mean by a purely scientific view, or even what we mean by scientific. Science, generally speaking, is the pursuit of knowledge through the recording and observance of phenomena which can be perceived by instruments and human senses. Now, human beings belong to the natural order, and in that we are well equipped to experiment within our sphere of existence. However, if there are other forms of life which do not belong to the natural order as we perceive it, will we be able to determine and verify their existence using tools from our level of existence? It would be rather arrogant of us to suggest, as the philosopher Baruch Spinoza did, that nothing can exist which cannot be scientifically validated. This tends to make science into a kind of God, or the humans which use scientific tools divine. In actuality, it opens up the question, is there a God? Now, what do I mean by the term God? I mean a being who is not bound by space and time, and who exists outside of what we would consider to be the natural world. Now, if there is, then I suggest that science may very well provide powerful arguments for this being's existence, but ultimately be unable to prove that existence absolutely. Now, it is not the role of the Christian to prove the existence of God. However, throughout the past 20 centuries, Christians have systemized ways of explaining God's existence for the purposes of dialogue and debate. The Bible, for example, never argues for the existence of God. It rather assumes that everyone is wise enough to recognize the evidence for God in the created world. Psalm 14:1 simply states, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." But why refer to such people as fools? Frankly, because the Bible states that human beings have been made in God's image, and that God has set eternity in the hearts of men. And in order to deny this, the atheist has to willfully suppress his very nature. Subsequently, the Scriptures are really about the fundamental reason we were created in the first place, namely, to have a personal relationship with our Creator, which will continue throughout all eternity. So in this video, we will examine 7 basic arguments for the existence of God, and I will put subject chapters in the description so that you can go to whichever one you want. So argument number 1. Are there any true atheists who actually live as atheists? Now, according to atheist philosophy, human beings are products of macroevolution and supposedly the most highly evolved animals on the planet. According to the Bible, human beings are made in the image of God the Creator. Now, the Bible assumes that we will have both a consciousness and a conscience of what is right and wrong, an instinctive understanding of moral laws such as murder, adultery, and theft, although these attributes are said to have been perverted through rebellion against God. Human beings are the only animals/mammals which are sentient creatures. We are aware of ourselves as individual selves. Therefore, we do a great deal more than simply act out of instinct. But we have moral values in how a particular self should treat other selves. The rest of the animal kingdom does not live by moral law. There are no concepts of right and wrong, of adultery or murder. In this system, the highest ideal is the survival of the strongest, so that the next generation is better than the previous. In the animal world, the weakest animals are usually destroyed by predators. They cannot run as fast, or they may be crippled, or they may have some defect. And this means, being killed, they do not pass on that defect to the next generation. This is what Charles Darwin referred to as natural selection, and it is thought to protect the species from extinction. Now, if there is no God, and we are all just products of macroevolution, then on what grounds do we change and effectively halt the precepts that govern natural selection? If we are to be true to the precepts of evolution, then should we exterminate any human being who was born with defects? If we are no more than evolved animals, then why have notions like compassion or love, fairness, right and wrong, adultery, stealing, or murder? Why indeed should we even talk about individual rights? All of these concepts are religious, or they come from religious philosophies, and they are only found in the one species that the Bible says are made in the image of God. So if a person claims to be a true atheist, let them live as if there are no religious concepts. Let them reject them all and all religious philosophies and live as if they are merely products of evolution. Otherwise, I believe they simply live as hypocrites. Now, obviously, it will be argued that such a world would be totally chaotic, and I agree with this. However, my argument still stands. If we argue that human beings are the most highly evolved animals, then how do we explain that we are also the most violent of species, killing and murdering each other for reasons which no other animal could possibly conceive? The vast majority of animals fight and kill for survival or in mating rituals. Yet the human animal kills out of envy, out of lust for power, jealousy, and a host of other reasons. One may also ask the question, why would evolution gradually evolve beings which are not only more violent and destructive than previous ones, but are basically capable of and working towards making themselves extinct? Doesn't that contradict the idea of evolving towards a more certain survival? The true atheist has a life with no hope, a life which ends in what the German philosopher Nietzsche called nihilism. Nietzsche understood that true atheism was to live like an animal, not a creature separated from other animals by virtue of being made in the image of God. Nietzsche tried to live as if there was no God, and in that he was not a hypocrite. And the result was that he spent the last 11 years of his life in a mental asylum. He lost his mind at a point where he saw a person mistreating a horse. He ran and he put his arms around the horse's head to comfort the animal, and then he burst into tears. Now I believe, after a very careful examination of his works, that he cried because he realized that this simple act destroyed his atheism. No atheist product of evolution could ever feel compassion for a poor horse. By having these feelings, Nietzsche realized that he was acting as a person with religious ideals, not evolutionary philosophy. This contradiction drove him insane because he could not escape the fact that he couldn't live as a true atheist. In fact, when Nietzsche was just 14 years old, he made a sworn written commitment to serve Jesus Christ all of his life. But he spent the rest of his life trying to deny the God he had promised to serve, and as a result, his writings show a man who was obsessed with a God he claimed was dead. Argument number 2. God as first cause, and this argument comes primarily from Thomas Aquinas in the 11th to 12th century. The English word because comes from this idea. Everything happens because something or someone made it happen. Behind every effect is a cause. Although this argument may be quite powerful at arguing a God behind everything, it also has some very weak points. For example, in this scenario, God may have just started everything and then just gone on holiday and left us to ourselves. This is the fundamental philosophy and foundation of deism. Also, God may have simply ceased to exist. Now, given the evidence of evil in the world, God may also be an evil God, not a loving one. However, apart from these criticisms, consider the fact that everything we see around us and in space is in motion, so it stands to reason that there was something or someone to begin this process. Everything is made up of atoms, and atoms are always in constant motion. Consider also that of all the animals in the world, humans are not necessary. Indeed, the world environment would function much better without us. According to some, it is human beings who are destroying the delicate balance of nature. Now, if the world has beings which are not necessary, then why are we here? Evolution would not evolve such beings, because the theory of evolution presupposes change for the better, rather than change in order to destroy the entire process. The answer or cause of this dilemma must of necessity be God, and the reason be much more than mere survival. The Bible suggests a perfect creation which has gone wrong because of sin, not as Darwin presumed, a chaotic world evolving towards perfection and creating only the necessary evolutionary steps to achieve that end. Human beings do not fit the evolutionary scheme in this sense. We may also ask about the source of moral ideas such as nobility, truth, etc., and ask what causes humans to have such values. These are not found in the animal kingdom in any of the so-called stages of evolution. If we study the next step down in the so-called evolutionary chain, supposedly chimpanzees, we find absolutely no moral concepts at all, not even a hint of philosophical thinking. The answer must be that these values are a reflection of a moral being we call God, who has planted them in the only animals made in his image, human beings. Now, Richard Dawkins, the militant atheist who wrote the book The God Delusion, admits that no scientist has any clue as to the first cause which began the universe, yet he argues that it must have been something very simple that became more complex. I find this argument pathetic in the extreme. How could any rational person say that the painting was more complex than the painter, or the song more complex than the composer? Yet atheists such as Dawkins refuse to apply this simple logic to the existence of the universe. Argument number 3, design. Chapter 3 of Time for Truth has several detailed examples of intelligent design, some of which are presented by leading agnostic scientists such as Michael Denton, so here I'm just going to give the basics of the argument. The Bible states that God designed the world. He's the creator of the world, that he caused it to come into being. Macroevolution claims that the world is the product of random chance. Now, one of the oldest arguments for intelligent design is as follows, and I'm sure most of you have heard it. A primitive man is walking across a desert when he finds a shiny object in the sand. It is a watch, but he's never seen a watch before. He plays with it and he accidentally winds it up and it starts ticking and moving. He has two choices as to its origin. The first choice is the evolutionary explanation. The watch was created when by chance, over a great long period of time, all of the parts accidentally flew together and it became a complete watch. The second choice is that someone designed the watch for a purpose. Now, although most use this argument to argue for the existence of an intelligent designer versus random chance, the most powerful part of the argument is often overlooked, namely the issue of purpose, which I will explain in the next section. Now, there are many examples of incredible design in nature which atheists have no explanation for whatsoever. For example, the structure and complexity of DNA, the exact tilt of the earth which determines our seasons, and even the intricate structure of a simple piece of grass. Even atheistic scientists have an impossible task to argue that such examples are random chance. For example, consider the debate regarding what is called the Big Bang, the theory that an explosion of immeasurable force began the formation and complexity of our universe. Friends, explosions never create order, only chaos. Yet our universe has laws, order, and fine-tuning which are almost incomprehensible. Consider these facts. Firstly, if in the moment of this Big Bang explosion there had been a difference in its strength of 1 part in 10 to the power of 60, that's 10 with 60 zeros, the universe would have expanded too quickly to form stars, or it would have immediately collapsed back in and on itself. Imagine firing a bullet at a target the size of a matchbox, which is on the other side of the observable universe, about 20 billion light years away, and hitting the matchbox dead in the center. Those are the same odds as 1 in 10 to the power of 60. Secondly, if gravity had been either weaker or stronger by a factor of 1 part in 10 to the power of 40, then stars such as our Sun would simply not exist. Thirdly, as our Earth orbits the Sun, it deviates from a constant distance by just 1/9 of an inch every 18 miles. Now that's around about 2.8 millimeters. If it deviated closer by 1/8 of an inch, that's around about 3.1 millimeters, we would be incinerated. And if away by 1/10 of an inch, 5 millimeters, we would move so far from the Sun we would all freeze to death. More importantly, if this minute deviation was there in the beginning, there would never have been life on Earth. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of such known facts concerning the fine-tuning of our universe, so we are left with 2 possibilities. Do we exist because of some unimaginable stroke of luck, or did a being of infinite knowledge and power design our universe as part of his plan for the creation of humanity? Theoretical scientists presume that everything necessary for the expansion and formation of the universe was, as is sometimes referred to, as a dot of pure creative energy. This dot exploded, and here we are. I prefer to believe that our universe was in the form of a seed, and God spoke it into being, and it grew precisely as designed, in the same way that we see the seeds of almost all biological life. In the past 40 years, the science of microbiology has discovered such complexity in the simplest of life forms that it is estimated that around 90% of scientists working in this field believe that an intelligent, creative agent is responsible for the creation of life. For example, the single cell is so complex that agnostic biologist Michael Denton describes it as the puzzle of perfection. Denton and other scientists' claims regarding the cell are discussed in a later chapter in Time for Truth dedicated to refuting macroevolution. Yet there is another part of this design argument which is worth considering. I would suggest that God has put his label on all creation. Some people like to wear labeled clothes which clearly state the designer of those clothes. Has God done the same with his creation? God told Moses that his name was I am that I am. Now this is like saying, my name is infinity. Also, Jesus Christ is called the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. In the Bible, then, God claims to be infinity. He is the source of infinity, and it is one of his attributes. Scientists have discovered that although there are a set number of types of atoms, there are no 2 atoms which are absolutely identical, partly because they cannot be in the same space at the same time. Now recently, a similar discovery has been found to be true of the parts of atoms. Now this means that it is impossible for any 2 objects to be exactly the same in the entire universe. For example, snowflakes, when seen under a microscope, are extremely complex and beautiful symmetric shapes. But if there are no 2 atoms alike, then logically there has never been 2 snowflakes exactly the same. William Bentley, an American farmer who was born in 1865 and later nicknamed Snowflake Bentley, photographed over 5,000 snowflakes. He was obsessed with their beautiful, intricate and complex designs, and he claimed that he had never found 2 that were exactly the same. Infinity is God's label. It's his trademark. On a more personal level, every human being is completely original, with unique fingerprints, eye, retina imagery, and DNA. This is a very powerful argument, and one which macroevolution cannot adequately explain. Argument number 4, purpose. Does life have a purpose? This question is inescapably joined to the issue of design. The watch in the desert has a purpose. Indeed, human beings do not design or create anything without a purpose. What drives purpose? What drives our instinct to create or compose, to invent, to write, etc.? Why are we the only creatures who desire purpose in our lives? The rest of the animal kingdom have but one purpose, the survival of their species. They may build a nest or a dam, but not for the pleasure of creating. They have no hunger for knowledge, no desire to invent. They simply answer and obey the instincts of their own species. Human beings find it basically impossible to live without purpose. We pursue happiness, often in foolish things such as material possessions or trying to find the perfect partner, and few people are completely satisfied. I believe that the seed of perfection lies in who we are as creatures made in the image of God, and until we discover His plan and purpose and will for our lives and become partakers of His divine nature, we can never know true fulfillment or joy. In evolution, the purpose of life is basically to survive and continue the species. At the end of his life, the atheist is just another dead monkey. For the Christian, life has a purpose. God created us with a purpose in mind. All of creation has a goal which is governed by God, and everything is moving towards that goal. But this argument also has some problems. Why not create a world which cannot have evil? This question is discussed in a separate chapter of Time for Truth, but for now, we must assume that the presence of evil must somehow fit into the Creator's ultimate goal and design, or He would never have allowed it. Argument number 5. Macroevolution is dead. There is an entire chapter dedicated to this topic in Time for Truth, so here I want to simply give you the basics. Since the 1960s, Charles Darwin's macroevolution theory has been basically disproved as an answer for the origin of existence, although some scientists still refuse to admit this. The studies of microbiology, quantum physics, cosmology, and biochemistry have found evidence of incredible design which evolution simply cannot explain. So why do I claim that macroevolution is dead? In his 1985 publication, Evolution: A Theory in Crisis, agnostic Michael Denton, a molecular biologist, points out the many contradictions to evolution theory. For example, the simplest independent life form known is the single cell. Now, to create a cell, you need certain proteins. These proteins are not found anywhere in the natural world. Rather, they are created by other cells. Therefore, you need a cell to produce another cell. It is impossible to create the first cell as there are no proteins around to create it. Evolution cannot find an answer to where the first cell came from, so it simply avoids the question. Michael Denton does not. But the problem for Darwin's theory is much more serious than a discussion on the origin of proteins. One of Darwin's most avid promoters in the 19th century, Ernst Haeckel, while examining cells in what we would now consider a rather primitive microscope, stated that a cell was a, quote, homogeneous globule of protoplasm, end quote. In other words, it looked like something which dripped from your nose. Haeckel couldn't have been more wrong. Even back in the 1980s, it was recognized that the single cell is more complex than around 15,000 computers linked together. 3 decades later, the foremost microbiologists are stating that the cell is infinitely complex, and none would ever refer to it as a simple cell. This issue is discussed in depth in Chapter 3 of Time for Truth. In his book, Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution, Michael Behe, who is professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University, Pennsylvania, expertly demonstrates the overwhelming problem that Darwin's theory has in explaining the complexities of many simple life forms, though some are not so simple. For example, the system used in the body to cause blood to clot in order to prevent a person from bleeding to death is what we call irreducibly complex. It is called a coagulation cascade, and to reduce its complexity, even in the slightest detail, would mean certain death to an animal or human through clots blocking arteries or not forming at all. Now, Behe claims that no one on earth has the vaguest idea of how the coagulation cascade came to be. Page 239 of his book. Now, Darwin claimed that all life evolved through many gradual changes and mutations, but scientists have discovered many irreducibly complex systems which did not evolve gradually at all, but are the creation of a master designer. To reduce these systems in even the slightest way would mean they would simply not work at all, not that they would work less effectively. The defense system of the bombardier beetle, the complexity of bacterial flagellum, the movement of a cilium, the mind-boggling complexity of vesicular transport, and the immune system are all excellent examples of systems which Darwinian theory is totally helpless to explain. And Behe points out that in America, evolution theory has become like a religion for many scientists, partly because of the heated debate amongst some Christian fundamentalists and scientists over the years. The fundamentalists have attacked scientists who in turn have defended their positions for reasons which are no longer scientific. The argument has become one of pride rather than seeking to discover the truth. Sadly, this position has also meant that textbooks continue to be used in schools and universities which are grossly out of date, namely because the alternative, teaching that an intelligent agent created the world, would be seen as a backward step and a defeat by liberal Darwinians. Argument number 6, the nature of humanity. What do people usually do when they are in trouble or terrified of death? During the Vietnam War, there was a common expression, "There are no atheists in foxholes." Foxholes were holes and tunnels dug into the ground where the enemy waited to ambush you. Soldiers had to go down and into these holes to find the enemy, but these places were extremely dangerous and filled with booby traps. In this situation, it was said that even the atheists prayed for safety. There is something inside a human being which makes us cry out to God when a situation has overtaken us. When we are rich, comfortable, and safe, we don't feel a need for God. We are often arrogant and independent. But when there is a flood, or a fire, or a typhoon, or a tsunami, something which humbles us through having no control over it, then we think of God, and even if only secretly, we pray. The father of atheism, Feuerbach, used this argument to suggest that human beings create God in their own minds to comfort them in times of stress and need. Was he right? Or is there an instinct within us which makes us call out to the one who created us? And the last argument, number 7, changing sides. One of the oldest and most frequent used arguments that God doesn't exist is the issue about evil and suffering. Skeptics will often use versions of what we call the Epicurean objection, an argument which goes as follows. If there is a God, why does he allow evil? Or, if God exists and he doesn't stop evil, he is either weak or powerless, or he doesn't care about people. They use this as an argument to deny God's existence. Now, this is a complex issue, and it is discussed in detail in Chapter 5 of Time for Truth. However, for the sake of argument, what happens if I simply change sides and stand with the atheists and we declare there is no God? Who are we going to blame for the evil and suffering in the world if we don't have a God to blame? Without a God to point a finger at, we are left with only ourselves, and in this regard, we would be correct in blaming humanity for all of the evil and suffering which we commit against one another. Atheists often love to point to the violence which has been committed in the name of God, and no doubt there is a great deal of evidence for violence from religion in this regard. However, this argument cannot be used to explain the atrocities of regimes such as the Soviet Union, North Korea, and others. But to conclude, the word atheist has come to be used by those who claim to not believe in a God or higher creative intelligence. This word comes from the Greek atheos, and its original meaning in Greek is also to not know God. In this context, the first Christians were accused of being atheists in the Roman Empire because they refused to believe in the divinity of the gods of Rome or the emperor himself. In this sense, there are millions of true atheists, and many of them are very religious people. Many Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others claim it is impossible to know God on a personal level. Therefore, by the word atheos, they are true atheists. They don't know God. They are as wrong about knowing God as Haeckel was about cells. The Christian's role is not to spend countless hours in pointless arguments about the existence of God, but rather to point people to ways that they can allow God to make himself known to them. I personally believe that if a so-called atheist will sincerely challenge God to prove his existence to them, that he will do exactly that. However, his response may well be in proportion to that person's sincerity in knowing the truth. If you would like a copy of Time for Truth, The Story of Salvation, you can find it on Amazon or on my website, and I will try to remember to leave a link below. Thank you for watching this video to the end, and I hope that it has been informative and helpful for you. Please remember to like and subscribe, and to share it with those that you feel may benefit from hearing it. God bless.